All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking on a really, I think, a pretty important topic, something that I know a lot of people out there struggle with, and that's depression. You guys sent in a whole bunch of really interesting material on this, and yeah, we're going to see what we can unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a really worthwhile deep dive.
Okay, so maybe to start off, who was Ramana Maharshi?
So it looks like he was a pretty important spiritual figure in India during the 20th century.
Okay.
David Godman, the guy in the interview, talks about how much people respected him. Like this guy was the real deal. He was seen as a prime example of what the Hindu spiritual tradition was all about.
Okay, so like a really, really important figure. So what made him so special?
Well, Godman talks about this really intense experience that Ramana Maharshi had when he was just a teenager. Like completely out of the blue, his sense of being a separate self just vanished.
Wow.
And he realized that his true identity was something much better, this universal self, pure consciousness. And this wasn't like years of meditation or anything. This was, bam, just a sudden shift. And it stuck with him.
That is wild. So he just like had this sudden realization and then that was it. Like he saw the true nature of reality, something like that.
Pretty much. And he understood that this self, this true self that he realized was inherently peaceful and happy. Like that's just what it was.
Okay, so it's like that peace and happiness was already there, but we're usually just not aware of it. So then how did this realization affect his life, after this happened when he was a teenager?
So apparently he had this profound impact on people just by being around them. Like Godman keeps talking about this spiritual radiance that Ramana Maharshi seemed to emanate and this like sense of peace and well-being that people felt when they were near him.
So he wasn't like preaching or trying to convert people. He was just like being himself.
Yeah, it wasn't about like giving sermons or anything like that.
Yeah.
His presence itself was enough. There's this one story about this woman who was really unhappy.
Okay.
And she just hung out near him for a while, didn't even talk to him or anything. And when she left, she was like totally filled with joy.
So just being in his presence had that kind of effect on people. That's amazing. It really does make you think about, the energy we give off and how that can affect the people around us.
Totally. Godman even mentions this concept of sanidhi. It's like his presence created this field of energy that could actually like calm people's minds. Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And you know what his main advice to people was? Super simple. Suma eru.
What does that mean?
Be quiet. Be still.
Okay, so easier said than done.
For most of us, yeah.
Yeah.
Our minds are like constantly going. It can be hard to just shut it off.
Exactly. Which I guess is where this idea of self-inquiry comes in.
Right.
Godman talks about how if people were struggling to just be still, Ramana Maharshi would encourage them to ask themselves, who am I? It's like this focused way of turning your attention inwards.
Yeah. The idea is to detach from all the stuff we normally identify with, our jobs, our possessions, our thoughts and feelings, and get to that underlying peace that's always there.
So it's like investigating the source of our sense of self.
Exactly. You keep asking, who am I? And you start peeling back all these layers of identity you've built up over time. And eventually you get closer to that fundamental self.
Okay, so that's like the core of Ramana Maharshi's teaching, right? This idea that peace and happiness are our true nature, and we can uncover them through self-inquiry.
Yep.
So let's get into what he actually said about depression.
Right.
We specifically wanted to focus on this today. And we have Talk 462 where this devotee is telling him that she's feeling really down because she's sick.
Okay.
And it's preventing her from meditating properly. She's like, her mind's racing. She can't breathe properly. She's getting really bummed out, especially because she's at the ashram and she's seeing everyone else being all peaceful. And she's like, why can't I be like that?
Right, right.
So what does Ramana Maharshi say to that?
So he's pretty direct right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
He tells her, this thought, I am not able to concentrate, is itself an obstacle.
Yeah.
Why should the thought arise?
So he's basically saying the fact that she's so worried about not being able to meditate is part of the problem.
Exactly. He's pointing out that this feeling of being unable to meditate, this frustration, is a thought. It's not like the absolute truth of her situation. It's just a mental barrier that she's created.
That's really interesting. It's like he's saying that our thoughts can create the very problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And then he makes this big statement, your nature is peace and happiness. Like that's it. That's the bottom line. And it's our thoughts, he says, that stop us from actually experiencing this truth.
So he's saying that peace and happiness are already there, but we're just blocking them with our thoughts.
Exactly. And he goes on to say that even the feeling of not being peaceful is just a thought.
Okay.
It's like a thought that's gotten stuck. It's not who we really are.
So in a way, he's saying that depression is just a thought, a mistaken thought.
Yeah, it's like this mental construct that clouds over our true nature, which is peaceful and happy.
Okay, so if it's just a thought, can we just, like, get rid of it?
Well, that's basically what he suggests. He tells her to get rid of her thoughts. He says, why should one attempt meditation, being the self one remains always realized, only be free from thoughts?
So he's basically saying if you can just be free from thoughts, you'll naturally realize your true nature, which is peaceful and happy.
Yeah, it sounds kind of radical, but that's the gist of it.
So it's not about achieving peace through meditation. It's about recognizing that peace is already there and just letting go of the thoughts that are covering it up.
Right. The struggle to get somewhere peaceful can actually make things worse if you're starting from the belief that you're not peaceful right now.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So if depression comes from these mistaken thoughts, where did these thoughts come from in the first place?
Well, Ramana Maharshi says it stems from this wrong identification of the body with the self. The devotee in the talk is feeling down because her illness is messing with her ability to meditate, right? So she's connecting her well-being to her physical state.
Okay, so because she identifies with her body, she thinks that if her body is not well, then she can't be well either.
Exactly. And he challenges this pretty directly. He says, the disease is not of the self. It is of the body. But the body does not come and tell you that it is possessed by the disease. It is you who say it. Why? Because you have wrongly identified yourself with the body. The body itself is a thought.
Wow.
He's saying that even our feeling of being a limited, suffering being is just a thought. It's a misperception. And because we identify with our bodies, we think that when our bodies are suffering, we are suffering too.
And that leads to depression.
Exactly. He's saying that we don't have to be depressed.
Right.
His advice is so simple, but so powerful. Be as you really are. There is no reason to be depressed.
Okay, so if depression is coming from this wrong identification and all these thoughts, I'm curious about what he has to say about thoughts in general, because I think that's something a lot of us struggle with, right? Like our minds are just constantly going.
Yeah, absolutely. And the material we have here really dives into that. He basically sees the mind as this bundle of thoughts. And all these thoughts, he says, are rooted in this I thought, the ego.
Okay, so the ego is like the root of all our thoughts.
Yeah, and he says that as long as we're clinging to this sense of being a separate self, a separate I, then we're going to experience suffering. In one of the talks, someone asks him about true knowledge, and his immediate response is, get rid of the I thought. So long as I is alive, there is grief. So basically, this feeling of being a separate individual, that's the source of all our problems, according to Ramana Maharshi.
That makes sense. It's like as long as we see ourselves as separate from everything else, we're going to experience things like fear, anxiety, and depression.
Exactly. And he uses the example of deep sleep, that dreamless sleep. When we're in that state, the I thought is gone. And we experience this natural peace and happiness.
Right.
But then we wake up and the ego comes back online and all these thoughts start popping up and they cover up that inherent joy.
So it's like that peace and happiness is always there underneath all the thoughts, but we just lose touch with it when we're caught up in our minds.
Exactly. And he says that realizing the self, seeing our true nature, prevents those thoughts from arising in the first place.
So going back to depression, he's basically saying it's just another thought, another temporary thing that doesn't have any real power over us.
Right. He says that it's a mere thought which has actually no stamina in it. He's trying to demystify it, to show that it's not this big, scary monster that we have to fight against. It's just a thought, and we have the power to choose how we respond to it.
Okay, so if depression is just a thought, and we know that thoughts come from the ego, then how do we actually deal with these thoughts, especially when they're causing us so much suffering?
Well, the material outlines a couple of ways to approach this. The first is surrender to God. It's about accepting whatever's happening as part of a bigger plan and trusting in a higher power.
Okay, so it's a more devotional approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he also talks about self-inquiry as a way to deal with these thoughts. The idea is to directly question the source of the feeling. So you ask yourself, who am I who is depressed, who feels the inertia? You're basically challenging the ego, the sense of I that's claiming ownership of the depression.
So by questioning the ego, you're weakening its grip on you, and that can lead to more peace and clarity.
Right. And he gives this really practical advice.
Yeah.
When you're getting overwhelmed by negative thoughts, ask yourself, these things didn't bother me in deep sleep. From where do they come now? That means they are not real.
That's a good point. Like, if those thoughts weren't there in deep sleep when we were closest to our true nature, then maybe they're not as real or as important as we think they are.
Exactly. And just recognizing that can create some space between you and the thought. You don't have to get so caught up in it.
So it's like, by remembering our experience in deep sleep, we can start to see that these thoughts are just temporary visitors. They don't define us. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it looks like the material also mentions watching the breath as a way to calm the mind.
Oh, yeah.
It's a way to like anchor your attention in the present moment so you're not constantly getting swept away by your thoughts. But, Ramana Maharshi's main point is that the real deal is to be completely free from all thoughts, even thoughts about ourselves.
Because ultimately, all thoughts are taking us away from our true nature.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, so I think we covered a lot today.
We did, yes.
So if we kind of try to sum up Ramana Maharshi's perspective on depression, it seems like he saw it as something that's not an essential part of who we are.
Right.
He saw it as coming from this mistaken idea that we are our bodies, and from all these thoughts, especially the ego-driven, I thought, that cloud over our natural state of peace and happiness.
Right.
And he believed that the way to overcome depression is to quiet the mind and investigate our true self through self-inquiry. You know, that question, who am I?
Exactly. It's about dismantling those false identifications and realizing the peace that's already there inside of us.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful message. And for anyone listening who's struggling with depression, I think it's important to remember that you're not alone. And there are tools and practices that can help you find your way back to peace and happiness.
Absolutely. If our true nature is peace and happiness, as Ramana Maharshi taught, then maybe it's worth taking a moment to just observe the thoughts that seem to contradict that. Next time you feel those feelings of unease or depression creeping in, try asking yourself, who is experiencing this? Just notice what comes up. It could be a small step towards that deeper self-inquiry that he's talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway for everyone.